So our next speaker will be Katie McDonough. Katie is at the Turing Institute. She's a lecturer in digital humanities at Lancaster University, and she's senior research fellow at Turing. She is trained as a historian here at Stanford in 18th century France, and particularly working with the French road system, which I love. And most recently has been a member of the Living with Machines project at Turing, and she's the UK PI of the Machines Reading Maps project, both of which are based at Turing. So Katie, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thanks so much. So I'm going to just say a few words this morning really about the history of the project and how we got to the point of where we are today. As David mentioned, we're a project that began with a grant based in the US and the UK. We have our US PI, Deborah Holmes-Wong, here with us today as well. Yayi Chang, who was the co-I on the US side. We were funded by a transatlantic funding opportunity from the NEH and the AHRC called New Directions for Digital Scholarship and Cultural Institutions. And there's a range of amazing projects that were funded through that opportunity that are all, in fact, looking at computational approaches to working with GLAM collections. So here you can really see the team as a whole before we began our conversations with David Rumsey and the Luna team. And you'll be hearing from, you've heard from many of these team members already, and you will hear from more today and tomorrow. And of course, it's important to mention that with the collaboration with David Rumsey, there are even more students from the Knowledge Computing Lab who are here with us today, and we're very excited for them to be here. So I wanted to just say a few words about why it's interesting to work with text on maps. Historians have traditionally gone to places, I apologize, I don't have a picture of people using maps in the David Rumsey reading room, but here you can see people in the British Library maps reading room looking at maps and, one by one, a few maps at a time. But it's very, very hard to go from the kind of research techniques that people are used to sitting down at a table and looking at maps and thinking with maps in this context, to then make use of the kinds of resources that we now have with digitized map collections. And here you can see on the left, a really beautiful visualization of the Ordnance Survey maps from the late 19th century created by my colleague Olivia Vane, where we can see just the kind of sheer number of maps. We don't have methods for exploring, for understanding the content of these maps. And that's really where we started with. That was kind of our original impulse, is how can we really learn to work with this data to be able to create data from map content, to do the kinds of things that Stace has been mentioning, to explore maps using the kinds of search mechanisms that are now possible with the Rumsey collection. So of course, text is not the only information on maps. There's lots of other kinds of symbology and other kinds of visual information. And there's lots of other projects that a number of us are involved with, that there's a growing field really of computational research with digitized maps. But machines reading maps really decided to focus on text precisely because, well, really since the 1990s, scholars in the history of cartography have been talking about reading maps, but not actually looking at the text, not taking that quite literally. And so it was an exciting opportunity to say, well, let's figure out how we can actually read maps as texts. And that was how we got started. Our original partners on machines reading maps were the National Library of Scotland, where we were working with the Ordnance Survey maps that you just saw, the Library of Congress, where we were very excited to be among the first people to use the recently sort of released into the public domain Sanborn fire insurance maps. It's over 400,000 maps. And of course, the British Library with their Ordnance Survey collections as well. So with these original partners, we pursued a variety of experiments, looking at different parts of what we'll come to think of as a kind of machines reading maps toolkit. So with the National Library of Scotland, we experimented with learning how to engage with the public to annotate maps, to collect and enrich information related to the text on maps. With the National Library of Scotland and the British Library's Ordnance Survey collections, we're learning how to analyze the content on maps through a research project to understand antiquities and historical sites as they are presented on 19th century British maps. We're figuring out how to share the data that we create through publishing open data in repositories here, the Stanford Digital Repository, as well as through the Library of Congress. And then finally, and this is where the collaboration that emerged with David Rumsey was particularly exciting, is to really come full circle and help people be able to actually search the data that the Map Curator pipeline creates that you're going to hear about in just a moment. So this gives you a little bit of an overview of the entire process, our workflow, and in orange, some of the kind of concrete tools that have been created on the project or that we're collaborating with. So of course, we have to make sure that maps are prepared or pre-processed. They're ready to be able to use in a computational pipeline. This is where infrastructure like AAAF and the new developments with all maps are particularly exciting for us. Second, we have to process the maps. We have to actually go from the image to creating structured text data in the form, as the case is with Map Curator, of GeoJSONs. Then we want people to be able to search that data. And that's where Luna comes into play. And it's been absolutely wonderful to work with them. I mean, you can see the power of visualizing the results really comes through when you can look at it and not just have a directory of 50,000 GeoJSONs. The work that Rainer is going to be talking about in a bit is really coming back to, well, how do we then engage with this data? How do we annotate the data? We can do that from scratch. A human can come to an annotation platform like Recogito, which many of you are familiar with, which is developed by the Pelagios project, and its successor, the Anatorius library that Rainer has been developing, which allows people to load a map, perhaps through its AAAF manifest, and to manually collect data about text on maps. And that, again, that kind of initial engagement with a map in a kind of one-to-one context was a really important point to connect to the work that we're doing to create and edit the automatic text results. So you're going to hear all about this workflow where we're working both to manually annotate maps. We're going to have a kind of AI assistance for annotating maps, and we have the purely automatically generated results from Map Curator that we can search and correct or tell new stories about and analyze. So the last three steps are really something that I've talked a little bit about before. We're going to then learn how to analyze the data. There's a whole package of work around learning to evaluate the data that's coming out of MapReader, and this connects up with the annotation work, because users, and I think Valeria has highlighted really nicely the way that it's incredibly important for us to engage with different communities as we begin to understand how we want to trust or not trust, correct, or enrich the data that is generated by artificial intelligence tools. And then finally, it's incredibly important for us to be doing this work in the open, to be sharing our data openly, to be sharing our methods openly. And so it's an important final step in our research workflow. I'm just going to say a few words about the original experiments before I wrap up. So this experiment with the National Library of Scotland to manually annotate maps of Edinburgh was a crowdsourcing experiment with the NLS Maps colleagues. It lasted about 2 weeks. We collected over 30,000 annotations from the 25-inch Ordnance Survey maps of Edinburgh. It involved about 70 people. And it was very exciting for us because not only were people collecting transcriptions of the text on maps, they were also labeling that text according to the function and the type the label, the text label on the map. And eventually, this is the kind of information that we want to be able to predict. And so collecting these annotations from users who have experience, most of these were actually residents of Edinburgh who were doing these annotations, was incredibly valuable. The goal for this initial crowdsourcing experiment was, in fact, to build a 19th century gazetteer of Edinburgh, to work to resolve some of the issues that Stace was mentioning. We don't have historical gazetteers for Britain. The second experiment that I want to just quickly mention is the publishing open data with the Library of Congress. We've been working with the Library of Congress Labs and the Maps division on this, and it's been an incredible experience. Map Curator output for the Library of Congress collection will represent about 10% of the Sanborn collection, or about 40,000 of the Sanborn pages from those atlas volumes. We're doing all of California. People here at Stanford will be excited to hear. We're doing all of Manhattan and New Orleans, and then we're doing a set of sort of random subsamples. We're also collecting with some amazing student research assistants and colleagues at the University of Southern California, gold standard data for the text annotations, including semantic types like we did with the National Library of Scotland data. And so here, our goal is really, in a sense, as a pendant to some of the Rumsey output, is to create text on maps data from non-geo-referenced maps. So the Sanborn collection has not yet been geo-referenced, but that doesn't mean that these tools aren't yet useful. And so processing this data, having the non-geo-referenced data, which means that every text label is associated only with pixel coordinates, as opposed to pixel coordinates and geospatial coordinates, is nonetheless very useful research data and discovery data. All right, so I'm going to wrap up here by just saying a few words about how we got started and what was exciting to us about the opportunity to work with the Rumsey collection. First of all, as you can see from the previous collections we've worked with, those are English language collections. They're often, series maps. They're very homogeneous in their styles, and they're quite modern. The Rumsey collection, as many of you know, is an incredibly diverse collection in terms of scales of maps, in terms of the languages that are represented on maps, the periods and the styles and the world regions of those maps. And so we didn't really know what the results would look like. And that was an exciting opportunity to really, in a sense, stress test the entire workflow and see what the results are, and to really begin to think critically precisely about the issues that Mike Keller just raised about, well, how can we make this work with multiple languages? So working with the Rumsey collection has meant that we can lower the barriers to engage with Map Curator output directly in a catalog setting. And this is just, it's hard to say how exciting this is for democratizing access to this kind of data. As you're going to see throughout the summit today and tomorrow, particularly in the workshop tomorrow, the tools that we're developing and the way we think about the data is really intended to help people bridge discovery and data exploration. And this is really important to us. And I think you can see that through all the rich opportunities that are already embedded in the Luna search. And finally, I think it's really exciting that the Rumsey collaboration really allowed us to encourage engagement with the results of machine learning or AI methods. Some of the work around annotation opportunities that Rainer will introduce will really show you the just where we've only really scratched the surface in helping people to think about what does it mean to search these results, to edit them, and to potentially use them in their research. We're excited to continue discussions about this and keep working on this as we go forward. So yeah, so now we have some time for Q&A before we have some caffeine, I think. Maybe all the speakers could come up. Yeah.
Hi, Katie. Jeff from Open Historical Map. Quick question. Is anyone that you know of doing research on like preliminary georectification based on just matching text POIs for like points?
I think that 2 rows in front of you or 3 rows in front of you, someone might want to say something about that.
Sorry, can you repeat? I was so excited to see you again. So. Okay, yeah, so we tried something like that before, but there are some complications. First, the placement of the text label is usually not, it's not agreed between all these different maps. And also when we are looking at abstract cartographical abstractions, sometimes you have, well, very often you get some location name got omitted. So these are not entirely reliable for this type of pattern matching. This is very reliable in geolocating satellite imagery when you have 2 sets of data that will show similar features. But we do use text labels as a starting point to help us find the location. Right. Yeah, so the way we are approaching the problem is we understand that there is no easy way to provide a perfect solution. So our goal is to be able to see how we can reduce manual effort in the process and maximize the value of all these historical data sets.
That's a good point. A good bounding box is useful too. Other questions?
So this is the first time, Tom Kramer from Stanford. This is the first time I've seen this, and it's amazing. So it's not a question, it's just a statement. Really, really nice on the Luna search and display. Is it, so a following question, is it true that what is produced from the machine learning pipeline is a JSON file that can travel with a map, and then indexing, display, further annotation all happens outside that environment?
So the way that the Luna data has been ingested is, yeah, there's just, I mean, well, actually, David Wong, do you want to say something about that? Or Drake, yeah.
I'll attempt to, but I'll pass it to David. So this is Drake Zabriskie kind of, but we're actually kind of, the JSON is separate. We're actually incorporated into our architecture right now. It would, as Stace was describing this sounds amazing that we could separate them and actually independently keep them. So we might want to look at that and be able to express it, also handing it off via IIIF. So that's more accessible. And so it's more accessible outside of the system. Right now, we're trying to ingest it into a system that we know we can manage, but I still think the search and all that kind of stuff, but for storage, that might be a great way. And for delivery back out might be a better way to handle it. But right now, David, right, we're ingesting it in to try to hold on to it so we can deliver it in a certain, for the search result.